So welcome everyone. It's my huge pleasure to introduce Bob Fischer to you today. First of all, I should just introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. And here at the University of Guelph, I should acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, one of the Anishinaabe people. And I was looking at their website yesterday, just because it's really interesting, I'd really recommend it. And they just have a lovely kind of opening quote that I'll share with you. The Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation is a thriving and vibrant community, bursting with peoples reaching for their roots as well as the future as they prepare to teach the next generation its history and culture. So very nice website, I'd really recommend it. Okay, so time for today's brilliant speaker. So Bob Fischer is an associate professor of philosophy at Texas State University, but he's actually based pretty locally. He's actually based in Rochester because he's sort of liberated from his normal academic duties by being senior research manager for Rethink Priorities. And Rethink Priorities is an NGO that basically advises effective altruism organizations on how to spend its money. So what's the best way to do good, and how on earth do we do these moral calculations? And it's the animal side of that kind of thing that Bob's going to talk to us today, because he's really interested in animal ethics. So amongst his many publications it's included a Routledge book, Animal Ethics, A Contemporary Introduction. He's co-edited with Claire Palmer, who's an old school friend of mine, actually, a book in the U4 Animal Welfare series on wildlife ethics. And recently, he's also got a paper in Science, which obviously makes me really jealous, on animal welfare methods to improve policy and practice, which explores how to assess human and animal welfare on a similar scale. So today he's going to talk to us about how to make interspecies welfare comparisons like this. We do it informally all the time, but can we do it formally? I don't think it's possible, but Bob's going to convince me otherwise. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much for, very kind of you. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the introduction, Georgia. Appreciate it very much. I'm sure that I will not convince you that we can do this in the rigorous way that we might like to be able to do it. However, we are going to try. And as Georgia says, we do in fact make these kinds of trade-offs all the time. We make them in ways that are totally ordinary, boring, common sense sorts of cases where we're thinking about companion animals and thinking, oh, they're particularly worse off than we might be, and so it's worth making certain sacrifices for them. We want to protect their well-being, so it's worth making certain kinds of trades. But you can think about lots of other cases that are interesting. I'm just going to mention two quickly to motivate the kind of work that I'm interested in. One of them should be familiar, from the world that you might engage with here, where you think about something like applying the 3 R's in laboratory animal contexts. And often people think, okay, well, I should use simpler animals rather than more complex animals. So if I have a choice between using primates and using mice, I should use mice. If I have a choice between using mice and using zebrafish, I should use the zebrafish. If I have a choice between those and using Drosophila, I should use Drosophila. And what could justify that, given the aim of the 3 R's? Presumably it's something like, oh, well, I'd be causing less harm if I were to do this research on zebrafish over a primate. That would be a reduction overall in the amount of harm I'd be causing. Well, that's an interspecies welfare comparison. You have to be able to say it's actually causing less harm to do something to a zebrafish than it is to a macaque. So how do we know that that's true? How can we ever tell that those things are the case? So that's one kind of situation. The situation that's of interest to me in particular, so I'm very focused on farmed animal welfare. And I want to figure out how animal advocates, people who are trying to improve things for farmed animals, can in fact do the most good possible, right? So you've got limited philanthropic resources. There are only going to be, like, the total amount of spending in the space for animal welfare related work directed to farm animals, $120 million, something like that, 150 million at most. There are a lot of farmed animals. $150 million does not go very far. So you have to make trade-offs. You have to decide what is the most effective way of spending those dollars. And one thing you might want to consider is, well, look, I could spend money on cattle, pigs, chickens, carp, shrimp, black soldier flies, right? Which of those is the species for which I could do the most good? And although there are lots of considerations that go into that calculus, one of them is the amount of harm that could in principle be averted, right? So there are tractability considerations. Do I really think that I can make a difference for pigs versus shrimps? Or there's also this further question, all right, given that I think I can make a difference of a certain kind, would it be better to be helping pigs versus helping shrimps, right? And so now we want to know, how on earth could we make these trade-offs? So this project is an attempt to answer that question, recognizing that there are going to be an enormous number of uncertainties, right? A huge number of uncertainties. And so from my perspective, coming into this as a philosopher, not as an animal welfare scientist, my attitude is something like, okay, we do this all the time. We really don't know how to do it. So can we just make an improvement on the status quo? The bar is going from completely unprincipled and arbitrary to marginally less unprincipled and arbitrary, right? So the standard here is not make Georgia happy, right? The standard here is get better than the completely ridiculous thing of just like trusting my gut and saying, I feel worse about pigs than I do about shrimps, right? Can we do better than that, right? So once we sort of get some perspective on the standard to which we want to hold the project, then I think we can start to see, well, all right, how might we proceed? Now, I'm going to walk you through a methodology. I'm going to sort of explain to you both why I think it's important and how we might pursue it. But I'm not attached to various details of this. And what I'm really hoping that we can do once I've gotten this presentation done is talk through some of the methodological details. And you can help me think through, like, are there ways to improve this? Can we sharpen it up in various ways? Can we make it better? Can we make it more useful? Can we see how it could become an interdisciplinary project beyond the scope of the one that we've already pursued? Okay, so that's the big picture. I promise that subsequent slides will go by faster. This is not an indication of the general pace, okay? All right, but so let's try now to figure out where we're gonna go. So I wanna convince you in just the first minute or two that we want to be able to make these comparisons in a more principled way. I've tried to motivate that with a little bit in the particular cases, but I want you to see some examples. So one is that, imagine it's 1970. You are wanting to do cause prioritization work in global health. You're trying to make decisions about how to trade off attempts to, say, reduce malaria versus improve clean water versus do cancer research, whatever, focus entirely on humans. And you would be very frustrated because you don't even have the basic tools in 1970 to do this when it comes to public health. And what happens is we get this enormous development. People start developing ways of allowing us to compare interventions that benefit people that can allow us to combine quality of life with length of life. That's the first important development in health economics, right? Where you start saying, okay, we've now got these quality adjusted life years, which is a tool we can use to start putting these things on a single scale. And we need something similar when it comes to making trade-offs for animals. We need something that allows us to say, okay, look, we're going to extend the life of animals if we put them in one system versus another, right? But then there are going to be different trade-offs associated with their lives if they're longer, right? You're still in an intensive production system. There still might be various costs to you. So how do we combine changes in length of life with changes in quality of life? So the slow growth case for chickens is one such case where we address some important welfare issues. You're not going to have as many keel bone fractures if you switch to a slow growth breed from conventional chickens, but there are various other stressors that are associated with living in a production system that you are then going to increase for those animals because they're going to live longer. So now you got to decide how are you going to balance those things off. So that's one case where you need this sort of judgment. We're also going to have to make lots of interspecies cases. So when you think about the judgment that I was describing for you earlier, or the judgment call that has to get made that I was describing for you earlier, where people who are philanthropists need to decide, should I be investing in cattle or in chickens, right? Addressing some particular welfare issue. Now we have to decide, well, which of these animals is worse off, right? If you're going to make that call, you have to decide which of these animals is worse off. So now we're going to need to make this interspecies case. It's not enough to look at quality versus length within a species. We have to look across species. And then we also have to be able to aggregate. Because of course, as we all know, many more chickens than cattle, head of cattle, right? So if we want to think about these trade-offs, we have to be able to think about them where we can somehow combine or compare cases that involve different numbers of individuals. It's not enough to say, how is one chicken compared to one steer? We have to be able to say, okay, if we've got 100 chickens, 1,000 chickens to one, how does that work out? So, given that we have these needs to make these kinds of trade-offs, right? Quality and length, most obviously, but also the interspecies case and different number cases, we're going to need some way of thinking about welfare that allows us to make these trade-offs. And so what I want to do is I want you to start thinking with me. Give me this for a moment. Let's think about welfare as a quantity, as a thing that comes in units. Think of it like water, right? You can have a certain amount of it. And if you can have a certain amount of it, then we can measure it, right? We can compare the amounts that we're getting, and we can sum it up, right? And we can come up with overall assessments of the welfare impact of different kinds of situations, right? How bad overall is it for animals in this or that production system versus how bad is it overall for different kinds of animals in different production systems, right? So be willing to go along for a moment with this analogy of welfare as being like water. Now, if we do this, we can have a very simple picture. I cannot make this thing go away permanently. It seems determined to return. So we'll see how long we can make it disappear. But so here is the conceptual tool that I want to introduce to you for thinking about this. What we want to do is think about how well or badly things can go for an organism at a time, right? We want to say top of the welfare scale for you and the bottom of the welfare scale for you is a way of representing the best and worst state of some kind or other. We have to say more about those endpoints. I'm not going to say a ton about the endpoints right now, but just roughly say, imagine if we think about your optimal welfare state, your worst welfare state on a simple 1 to -1 scale, right? If we do that, if we imagine that we can normalize all welfare on a single scale like that, and then we can do something like identify percentage changes in welfare, then we can start comparing welfare across species. Now, what does this mean concretely? What this means, like the 1 to -1 assumption is just a simple scale that we use. Same kind of scale has been used in health economics to make comparisons across humans. We just assume that sort of the peak and the valley for everyone is the same. Here we're making this assumption across animals. And what we're doing with this percentage stuff is assuming that there's something like a rough neutral point and saying, here's where things are neither good for you or bad for you on balance. That's that line down the center. And then we can say, well, you seem about, I don't know, half as well off as you could be in this situation, or maybe 20% as badly off as you could be. And these estimations are enormously rough. But you can imagine how we might start making them, right? You might take the 5 domains model and assign scores to how well an animal is doing across a given set of domains, and have some simple method for aggregating those into an overall score, and say, roughly, here's where we think the neutral point is, here's where things are going better than that, here's where things are worse than that. Of course, there'll be lots of subjective judgments in that, but implicitly, we make those kinds of judgment calls all the time because we make decisions about when animals need to be euthanized. And we decide, right, if you go and talk to veterinarians about, when should this companion animal be euthanized, they have guides, right? A point system that they will use to say, like, well, this is how you can think about this decision. And so we are somewhat familiar with this, right, as a simple decision-making tool. It's rough, it's coarse, but it's a starting point. So a welfare range is just how well or badly can things go for you at a time. And then if we can do this at a moment, at a time, we can aggregate over time, right? To get overall welfare levels or for organisms as we're working out this process of making these changes. So that's the first step, right? The first conceptual tool. Now, it turns out, though, that Americans, at least, I'm sure that the Canadians are more enlightened, but the Americans, they are not convinced that all animals can suffer equally. So this is a paper I was on a couple of years ago, and what we were asking people was about the intensity, the possible intensities of suffering of animals. And so it's a slightly weird setup, but you're trying to ask, we're asking people, when would a program that affected one kind of animal be better than a program that benefited another kind of animal? All right. And so what you see is that in the blue column there, this is the smallest number of animals where people think you'd be getting greater overall reduction in suffering when they're looking at a particular species. So if you land in that blue column, people who said that, they're basically saying that they think that cattle and chickens can suffer equally. And so all that really matters is the number of individuals. But if you fall on one other side of that, you're learning that people think there are some differences in these species, right? If you think that it would take 100,000 chickens to get as much benefit as benefiting 1,000 head of cattle, you think that the capacity to suffer in a chicken is a lot less than the capacity to suffer in a bovine. Now, what do these people know? All right? I'm not saying these people are right. I'm just pointing out to you that there is this intuition out there that people have, which is, there's some important differences between these species. And maybe these intuitions are naive. Maybe they don't track anything that we should care about. But it's worth flagging that they are there and then asking ourselves, okay, well, is there anything? Like, do we think that there are some important differences in the cognitive capacities of different species that are relevant to welfare, that are relevant to how much welfare is at stake in any given animal, right? So again, if you think about welfare being like water, we could say, well, maybe it's the case that animals essentially are buckets of different sizes. So it's not just that welfare is this quantity such that we can have different amounts of it, but that maybe pigs are a relatively big bucket among farmed animals, and black soldier fly larvae are a relatively small bucket. Maybe it's the case that there is much more welfare at stake, as it were, in cattle in principle than in carp. Now, we have to figure out why would this be the case, right? I haven't shown you why it would be the case. All I'm doing is pointing out that in principle, this is possible, right? If we take the metaphor seriously, that there could be relevant differences. And then the question would be, how would you estimate them? But to go back to our notion of a welfare range, slightly more formally, what we have is, right, we had a scale before where we assumed the 1 to -1 scale. And now essentially what we're saying is, well, look, maybe that it's actually not 1 to -1 for every species, and there's variance. So we need to have when we put these things on, when we try to compare units, yeah, you get the same percent change, but you're dealing with a smaller potentiality, right? There's less welfare and principle at stake. This still lets you convert from one to the other, but if you could estimate those differences in welfare ranges, then you could get this result where you could figure out what exactly is the unit, or how do we convert from units of, say, chicken welfare into dairy cow welfare, right? And notice that it's going to flip what you should do. So you go back here, right? If you look at those numbers at the bottom, we get different aggregated results in terms of how much welfare is at stake overall, okay? So that's the conceptual tool. And then once we introduce the idea of variation, we then get this question about, okay, now could we get buckets of different sizes? So now we got to figure out, okay, we listened to this interesting conceptual possibility, interesting, sure, maybe welfare works that way, who knows? But if we can't operationalize this notion, if we can't make it at all precise, we can't see how we would go out and measure it, then what are we talking about? Like, what on earth is the upshot, practically speaking, if we don't have a method for doing this? So what I want to just point out is that there are things you could do in principle in a very rough way, in the same sort of way that economists have proceeded. So I don't want to defend this. In fact, I'm going to criticize it in a second, but I want you to think for a minute with me in the way that someone doing high-level prioritization work might think. So imagine you're the World Health Organization, and you're trying to decide where your limited resources should go. And you're trying to decide, well, what's the best thing for me to do, given all the uncertainties about how I can do as much good with these limited resources? You might be willing to do what economists were willing to do for a long time and still are willing to do sometimes, is to use income as a proxy for amount of well-being. And say, well, right, more income, higher well-being, lower income, lower well-being. And you might say, Bob, that's ridiculous. This is the worst idea I've ever heard. There are so many ways in which income does not track well-being. And if I were at the World Health Organization, I'd be like, thank you for this excellent observation. I never said they were perfectly correlated. All I'm telling you is, if I have to make a better judgment than flipping a coin, maybe income is the right tool to use, right? It's an improvement on nothing. It's not optimal. It's an improvement on nothing. And so you might think that something like some neural metric, again, would just be an improvement on nothing when we're doing these comparisons with animals, right? So what if we did this with something like the number of neurons an organism has? That would kind of roughly track our intuitions. It does feel like fruit flies can't really matter as much as pigs, maybe. They differ in their number of neurons by a lot. Could that be the tool that we use, right? And so it's possible, if you think about it this way, you're sort of getting into the right frame of mind, and you can see how the calculation would then go. We can make these comparisons and then crunch the numbers and, again, convert units or convert into a common unit, right? So now we can express changes in chicken welfare in a unit that's comparable to changes in cattle welfare, right? But understandably, you might balk. You might say, well, you know, what on earth do the number of neurons actually tell you about an organism? Sure tells you all about body size, but like that doesn't seem to matter in and of itself. Maybe it tells you about intelligence, but it's unclear why intelligence really matters for welfare, right? Often what we think is what matters is how much you can suffer, not whether or not you're smarter than some other species. So we might really worry that even if you could use neuron counts in this sort of way, the way economists have used income, that it would be a kind of mistake to do that, right? It would be looking for the wrong sort of thing. And then you could say, look, even if neuron counts were a proxy for something that mattered, we can still ask, is it the best thing we could do, right? Is this as good as it gets, right? And the answer might be no. We have to find out, but the answer might be no. So think about where we've come, right? I tried to motivate for you the idea that we need to make these interspecies comparisons. I tried to give you a way of thinking about welfare where in principle it's a summable thing that we could aggregate, that we could use to make prioritization judgments across differences in species, number of animal, etc. I pointed out that we can use this simple tool of a welfare range, thinking about how well or badly things can go for an animal at a time, as a way of representing changes in welfare. And if we think that in principle we could get buckets of different sizes, as it were, then we can think about this welfare range as telling us something about how much welfare could be at stake in a given kind of animal. How well or badly could things go for an animal of a given kind, right? In a common unit. So that's the big picture now. So let's try to do better than income as a proxy, is it, you know, if we think about the human case or the neuron count case in the case of animals. Can we see a way of doing this in a more principled way? So what I want to do on this next slide here, I want to tell you a general approach that I think we could use. And then I'm going to try to apply this in a slightly more detailed way and show you what we did. The group that I worked with for 18 months on this project in 2021 and 2022. So the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to figure out what on earth do you think welfare is. I've been talking about welfare in the abstract, you know, highest possible level. But we got to say something about what welfare is, right? Is welfare about affective states? Is welfare health? Is welfare the capacity to exhibit natural behaviors? Is it some combination of the three? Is it something else entirely? Philosophers have their own ways of carving up the landscape of welfare, right? How should we think about that? But then, once we've said something about what welfare is, we can go on and say, all right, can we identify proxies, empirically detectable proxies, that would be evidence of variation in the ability to realize welfare, whatever welfare happens to be? If so, then we could go and find that variation. We could catalog it, right? We could look into the empirical literature, we could study the relevant animals, we could find out where is there a basis for variation. And then we could find some way of converting that information into overall scores that would tell us the relative welfare ranges of different species. Lots of uncertainties at every step, lots of questions to ask at every step. But this is a general method that you could use in principle if you were wanting to think about this project, right, across all of the species that you might be interested in. So let's just run through a version of this and see how it might go. So let's suppose that you have the correct view and you think that welfare is hedonic states, right? That's what it comes down to. How much positive affective state do we have in this organism? How many negatively valent states do we have in this organism? Pleasures and pains, right? the Benthamite utilitarian picture, you think that welfare boils down to feeling good and feeling bad across the various dimensions of feeling good and feeling bad. So suppose you have that kind of view, then you might say, okay, now what does welfare boil down to? It boils down to the intensity of these different states, right? Minor pains aren't as bad as intense pains. Minor pleasures aren't as good as the intense pleasures, right? And so the thought goes that we now have a thing to look for. What we want is evidence of possible variation in the intensity of valence states. Under what conditions would we expect animals to be able to have more intensely valent states than others? Now there's a lot of conceptual questions to ask there. Maybe you think every animal just has the same range. We can talk about that. But if you think that there can be variation, then hedonism is going to tell you what to look for, right? Hedonism says welfare is about valent states. And now we know that given that the intensity of the valent state affects how much it impacts welfare, we're going to look for variation in the capacity to have more or less intensely valent states. Again, we're going to go look in the literature. We're going to find out what there is, study the animals, and we're going to aggregate, right? That's the large-scale project that we're going to pursue if we're hedonists, right? How are we going to do this? What is the method? Very roughly, what we're going to do is this. We're going to think, well, what are valent states for? Why do we have them? And there are different stories people tell about this. Maybe valent states are the common currency that organisms use to make trade-offs. Maybe it's the case that valent states are ways of representing fitness-relevant information to an organism, right? Whatever the case may be. But there are these theories out there, right? People have proposals about what valent states do for us evolutionarily. And then we can say, if those are the functions, what would be evidence of a difference in the ability to realize that function? So if valent states are about representing fitness-relevant information, then what would be evidence of difference in the capacity to represent that kind of information? Well, now we're getting to something that starts feeling very attractive, right? Because we do have things we can use to think about, well, how much information can this organism retain, right? Over what period of time? What's the working memory of this organism, et cetera, right? We can start to think about the way we would proceed if we were going to operate this way, all right? And then we're going to have these questions about scoring and aggregation. This is really hard. Now we've got all these proxies that we've gone out and looked for. Say more about that in a minute. What are we going to do with them? Again, think in a flat-footed way. Think like an economist in 1970, right? They're lovely people. It's just they were doing their best, you know, and they, you know, what you say, okay, well, look, I don't know. It's really hard, you know, but you've got all these proxies. You're going to find some simple metric that you can use to say, well, we think this trait's present. We don't think this one's present, right? We're going to find some simple way of proceeding. And then eventually we're going to come up with a tool for aggregation, right? And I can say more about each of these steps, you know, during Q&A. But essentially what we are doing is we're going to say, all right, look, we've got some information that we can collect about these organisms. We're going to have to figure out how on earth we can aggregate it. We're going to be uncertain about how we're going to aggregate it. But there are tools that we can use when we're really uncertain and we're building models, like a Monte Carlo simulation. And what a Monte Carlo simulation does is say, here is a function. Here is a domain. Just keep selecting random variables 10,000 times over from that range, and it will spit out a histogram. It says, here is the pattern, right? Here is the distribution that you should have for thinking about whatever thing you're trying to estimate with that function. And so similarly, we can do something here where we can just aggregate across our uncertainty to get an overall picture of, well, what roughly should you think? What's the rough comparison that you ought to make? So we did this. Now, not saying the way we did this is the right way of doing this, but we tried. And so what this does is it represents a bunch of more cognitive and more hedonic related proxies that we went out and just tried to see what the literature told us about these traits. And the traits were picked by talking to a bunch of people and saying, all right, what do you think you should look for if you were looking for variation in the ability to have these, variation in the capacity to have more intensely valent states? And we just came up with a long list and went and saw whatever we could in the literature, right? So we looked at over 100 different traits, and mostly what you see is gray in that picture. And gray means there's just no information. We looked at 11 farm species, right? Pigs, chickens, carp, salmon, shrimps, honeybees, octopuses, silkworms, and black soldier flies. And we did that because we were just looking for the animals farmed in the greatest number. Octopuses are not farmed at this point in the greatest number, but octopus farming seems to be on the cusp. And so they're interesting for that reason. And so what we did were we were just asking, okay, look, let's just try to implement the methodology. Let's just run through it and see what kinds of results emerge. And so what you get was something like this, where, again, assuming hedonism, what you're trying to say is how intense do you think are like the most intense valent states that a pig can have versus a human, and a chicken relative to that, and so on and so forth. And we come up with thinking, hey, actually, maybe they're just not that different in the grand scheme, right? Maybe they're all actually relatively similar, which I think is not a crazy view if you're a hedonist. Because if you're a hedonist and you're thinking biologically, you have to think, what is the mechanism that explains why a pig's pains would be massively less intense than a human's? I have no idea what that would be, right? So probably if you're going in for hedonism, you should think that we have fairly similar welfare ranges, right? And so we get this big fancy table, and like we could talk about all the details of these particular estimates. These were run with slightly different kinds of numbers than the ones that, or with different kinds of inputs than the ones from the previous thing that I showed you. But the point here, the important point is not the specific numbers, which you need for certain kinds of cause prioritization decisions, but rather that there is a way that feels somewhat principled to get you in a ballpark and to check your sort of naive gut assumptions. You might have thought chickens mattered, as some people did, as I showed you in that survey, orders of magnitude less than cattle. And if this is right, or even in the ballpark, it says, well, that's just going to be like a hard conclusion to justify if what you think welfare is the intensity of valent states, right? More pains or fewer pains, more pleasures or fewer pleasures. It's going to be a hard thing to justify. And so we're going to need to treat these animals much closer to equal than we might have otherwise thought, especially once we start aggregating across individuals, and we're talking about millions, or billions rather, of chickens versus millions of cattle. So this just gives us a way for starting to think about how we might make these comparisons. And of course, if we do that, we're going to go back, we're going to have our welfare range estimates, we're going to then be able to convert into a common unit. So that's the talk. I am supposed to, before anybody has to leave for whatever reason, I have to quickly plug 2 events here, and then we will discuss things. One is that there is a event about sentience in insects tomorrow, which of course everyone is encouraged to attend. The second is that there are many events coming up in the new year. I'm actually hoping to come back for the one at the end of January. This is all very exciting. You will have wonderful events here. It's thrilling, But now we are actually done.
And what we'll do is alternate between questions from the room and questions from the Zoomers. And Bob, I'll let you deal with
Great.
questions.
Yep, sounds good. Go ahead.
Silent as now.
Great.
Get us started off.
Tremendous.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I enjoyed the calculations, but I guess my question is, in terms of literature bias and the amount of time we spend studying certain species, what is the lack of research categorized? Is it categorized as a no? And if so, is that unfair to species who aren't of interest to us, who aren't as cute or as human-like, or aren't as easy to study in terms of certain aspects that we might value in ourselves that might be easier to find in other species?
Great. So it's definitely going to work out that any method we use that is based on looking at the actual literature is going to be subject to these kinds of biases. And it's not just going to be biases based on our interests. It's also going to be based on the difficulty of working with some species relative to others, right? We're just better at figuring out how to run certain kinds of tests with some organisms than others. And so we're going to get some significant result. Now that, it could be seen as a really significant problem. And from a working out the details perspective, of course, we want to then figure out how can we correct for that insofar as we can. And actually, we've had some discussions with Eileen and Jesse about how you might improve this. And there's some potentially simple metrics that you might use for thinking about the relative number of publications on a given species or with respect to certain search terms that might help you think about how you could adjust. That being said, I think it's really important to always keep the macro level purpose in mind. So the question from my perspective is not, should I trust that number? Right? The question from my perspective is, should I trust that number more than my off the cuff, here's how I feel about pigs relative to carp? And if that's the test, right, or that's the benchmark that we're trying to clear, you might still think numbers that have a literature bias affecting them are still better than, pigs cuter than carp, which might be all I was operating with before, right? So I think it's a significant issue, and yet potentially not one that's going to be decision relevant. And so the question, and you're just going to hear me repeating this kind of move over and over again. And one thing you should ask is, when is it a cop-out? And when is it a fair response? But I'm going to keep trying to say over and over, but hey, do you have anything better? Do you have anything that's not going to just reduce to trusting our guts? But still, I do think we should try to apply some correction. So I would totally want to concede that.
So I like this idea of when something is better than unvetted instinct. Because we don't know what the ground is or what the right framework is, presumably the only thing we can test an approach like this against is our gut instinct. Which is a little circular, but what I'm wondering is, have you had a chance to do this in any way, just seeing how often, even within your group, how often is this drawn and what conclusions to what your instinct would be? And then are there cases where you would hope this numerical approach would actually draw a different conclusion than that instinct to sort of justify our uncertainty?
And would you mind repeating for the people online? We had a request.
Yeah, sure. So let me make sure that we've got the question. So one part of the question is, are there cases where there was a significant difference between the intuitive answer and the one that comes out of the methodology? And then what's the second question?
add certainty or help build confidence in methodology. Places where you think our gut instincts are, or even places where our gut instincts aren't that good, and this would be better.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, let me just report to you my own experience of doing this. So I came into this thinking, I just don't really care about invertebrates. I was like, they just don't seem like they could possibly matter that much. Who knows what's going on in them, but probably not very much. And I should mostly just focus on the vertebrates in terms of thinking about where you could do the most good for improving welfare. And I walked away from this thinking like, oh, actually, I have a really hard time explaining why I would assign extremely low probabilities of sentience to a lot of these organisms. And I have a hard time seeing how I could justify thinking that even if they were much less likely to be sentient, that they would have very, very tiny welfare ranges if they were sentient, right? Because they do seem to have lots of the behavioral markers, at least in some cases, that make them seem like there's a fair amount going on. So I walked away from this thinking that, oh, maybe what you should say is that the trade-off rate is like 1,000,000 to 1 when you're looking at chickens versus black soldier flies. And then I came away thinking like, yeah, something a lot closer to 1 to 100 or something now seems like a much more reasonable thing. So that changed my view by orders of magnitude, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm right, but it is an indicator of the shift in my thinking as a result of doing the process. I will say that my own, when I've shown this to other people, they very strongly had the intuition, look, all animals are equal. Like maybe humans are special, because of course everyone has to say that humans are special. But among the non-human animals, they're all equal. You should just treat them. And that's fine. Like I actually don't think that's a crazy view to maintain. And in many ways, it makes my job very simple. Like if my job is to advise people about how to make trade-offs, then the numbers just always dominate, right? And so when you're thinking about applying the 3 R's, and you would use way more Drosophila than you would zebrafish, you should use the zebrafish, right? And likewise, basically, shrimp and insects always win when it comes to farmed animal welfare prioritization, because there are just trillions of them. And there's nothing else we farm or kill in such enormous numbers. So that being said, it's very hard to shake the idea that welfare has something to do with the subjective states of an organism. And there are massive differences, presumably, in the subjective states of different kinds of organisms. Those neurological differences have to matter somehow. And so then it seems like you should have some stratification, just maybe not nearly as much as we might have thought intuitively. So that's how I sort of come out on that question. So Stefan's been waiting, then back here, then George.
Well, great talk, very clear, really enjoyed it. I guess I'd like you to say a little bit about what kinds of caveats you think this should come along with when it's being presented as a tool that policymakers might use. I have 2 general sorts of worries.
Yeah.
One is that, you portray the situation as if the alternative is a kind of random coin flipping. And I'm wondering if that's really accurate all the time. And you'd know more about this than I would, but it seems to me that, what a funding agency can do sometimes is just be opportunistic. We've got the salmon aquaculture industry that wants to make some changes. Hey, let's sort of throw some money at that,
Yeah.
right? So the baseline might not be, we're just throwing money around by our guts. We're being strategic in another sense, taking the opportunities.
Yeah.
So then comes along this method, and it's got this kind of authority around it because it's using numbers and it's scientific, right? And I mean, I'm pretty critical of the use of economic tools when they get more authority than they're due. I think that that can lead to bad outcomes. And so, right, so my question is, what kinds of caveats do you think should come along with this if it's being presented as a tool for policymakers?
Cool. So the question is, what caveats should you incorporate if you are thinking about this as a tool for policymakers, given that there may be a wide range of limitations to these kinds of tools, and that they may be given more authority than they're due, and that there may be other strategies for improving the world that do not require any such tools. So there are a couple of things to say. One is there do seem to be cases where we just straightforwardly need to make welfare-based prioritization judgments. So I think, again, the lab animal case where you're looking at the 3 Rs is such a clear example of that, where you're just being told flat out, minimize the amount of harm that you cause, and people are replacing one kind of organism with another on that basis. And that seems like a case where there isn't another tool. Like, you have to make it on a welfare-based judgment call. So that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that, there are different, there's policy in the sense of a practical procedure that someone might use, and we're speaking in the most general matter, an NGO's policy might be the one that we have in mind, versus policy when we're talking about, like, what should the Canadian government do? Or what should the US government do? And of course, in those kinds of contexts, when we're really thinking about federal policy, we're thinking about the kinds of things that we might want to implement that affect a democratic body. Well, then maybe you have to use tools that are, I think, quite awful, but are more appropriate in that context. So maybe what we need to do is welfare range estimates based on surveys of the public, right? Because what we need to do is have some kind of voting procedure where we're actually representing the views and values of the larger society. I think those views are going to be very problematic. I think there are going to be a zillion reasons why you should not trust them. But the truth is, like in the US, if you look at the benefit cost analyses that are done at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, in Washington, you do not have to incorporate individual animal welfare. And there is no straightforward way of doing that. And so there, getting any clear value for animal welfare would be an improvement over the status quo, because right now it's 0, right? So I might take the surveys over, over anything else if that's all there, the only feasible option in that context. All right, but now sort of like to think about the hardest version of your problem, where you're thinking about, here you are, you're a philanthropist, you're trying to decide how to do the most good. Should you just be opportunistic? Should you just use, some procedure of that kind? Well, maybe you should. However, notice that ultimately, we're often in situations where there are more options available to us, than we're going to be able to use this is a strategic opportunity criteria to sort out, or criteria to sort out. In that case, we're going to have some better procedure. We can't just say, well, aquaculture is listening, because there's also the possibility that the shrimp industry is listening, and that when it comes to chicken depopulation, the AVMA is suddenly willing to have a conversation, and blah, 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 right? So in those kinds of cases, we're going to need other tools, and the question is just going to be like, well, what can we introduce? But at the highest level, thinking about the core question, what caveat should we have? I think the answer is something like, well, you're right. Think about when we actually need this information. And of course, if we can proceed without this information, and we have very low confidence in the results, proceed without the information. But it just turns out maybe we can't always do that. Yes.
Specific species where we know that there's clear biases and how much emotion, I guess, we describe them. So thinking like cats and dogs, and you compare that against species where scientifically we wouldn't really expect there to be a difference, to see if the number sort of pull it down.
That's a great, so the question is, have we looked at species where we would expect there to be a emotional capacity bias, as in companion animals, for instance, versus other sorts of animals to check whether, how the literature is being skewed by these results? Short answer, no, we have not. It's a great idea, wish I'd thought of it. And it does seem worth doing.
Down to uncertainty into your models, because in your point scoring system, you're kind of assuming that, say, avoidance learning in pigs counts the same as avoidance learning in Drosophila. But if we have behaviors that look similar to our own in another mammal, we also know they're driven by the same underlying machinery. So it's only a small inferential leap.
Right.
A small inferential step to assume that sentience is involved, but where we're looking at completely alien organisms whose neural apparatus is really different, how we get to avoidance learning could be completely different and just be nociceptive. So I wonder how you factor in that uncertainty.
Great. So the question is, how do we factor in uncertainty given that the traits, the proxies that we're looking at, there's uncertainty about the mechanism that produces those behaviors across species, and that you might think we really have no idea what's causing some particular sort of behavior that's classified similarly in Drosophila as the mechanism that's producing it in pigs. Short answer is no, we do not have a discount for that, other than the fact that all of these things are adjusted by the probability of sentience. So there are two components to these estimates. So there's one process, which is just, hey, here are a bunch of proxies that you could use for sentience. Let's spit out some sentience estimates on that basis. And then we're going to take, when we do the welfare range estimates, the idea is let's condition on sentience and then see what welfare range you would get, and then discount accordingly. So if you think that the probability of sentience for, say, insects in general, just averaging across them is like pretty low, 0.1 or something like that, then you're just going to get a corresponding adjustment. But notice that you're not going to get huge orders of magnitude difference out of that, right? So it's probably unreasonable. Oh, okay. I think it's unreasonable to have a probability of sentience in insects that's like 0.001 or something like that. And the idea would be nobody knows anything about consciousness, super hard. No, there's no accepted theories. Like we're so massively uncertain about absolutely everything when it comes to studying consciousness that really what you should think is like, I don't know, like lots of things are possible. And so I'm not saying we should think that these things are sentient. I'm just saying that we shouldn't speak so confident to say I can essentially rule out sentience by setting that probability super, super low. But if you do that, then it turns out to not be a huge factor in the overall estimates, right? Now, there's a different version of your question that I think is actually thornier. And that version is as follows. So suppose you've got, reversal learning in one species and reversal learning in another. You might still think that they shouldn't get the same score because it's a more sophisticated version of that capacity in one species than another, even if you thought they were both sentient. So then you might think, well, look, this very simple scoring mechanism you've got where you're like, okay, do you see maternal behavior? Or like, do you see reverse learning, or do you see like numerical cognition? That's too coarse-grained. And what you should have is a 10-point scoring system or a 100-point scoring system or whatever. And that's going to produce much larger differences. The only thing, and then, so then the right thing to say about our numbers is, well, yeah, you've sort of artificially produced these narrow welfare range, or these narrow differences in your welfare range estimates. Why did you do that? Based on ignorance, because we don't really know how to compare these traits across species. All I can say to that is, if we are genuinely ignorant, then we should not be assuming difference, right? And so I still think that practically it's the right assumption to insert, though we should acknowledge the possibility of much larger differences than the methodology is immediately outputting.
There's a question online.
Yeah, let's do it.
What can we do with species that don't have tools to measure well-being, like arthropods or bees, for instance?
So why would we assume that we can't assess the welfare of those organisms? I guess is the first question in response to that. But so I think maybe we should sort of separate out these two things. So one is, notice that there are two basic components. Right? If we scroll way back here, boy, you get vertigo when people do this, don't you? When we scoot back to this original sort of conceptual tool that we had about welfare range estimates, I saw this as a two-part project. Right? The overall prioritization game is a two-part project. One part is me coming along and saying, hey, we got to make these interspecies comparisons. Is there any way that we can compare the lengths of the scales on which you measure welfare for different species, right? But then there's a second question, which is, once you've got the scale, how do we do the ordinary process that we've been doing of assessing welfare for different species? So how do you figure out when things are going about as well as they could for a chicken? How do you figure out when things are going about half as badly as they could for a silkworm, right? Now, I haven't said anything about how you do that, right? Also not my job. You're all paid handsomely for this exact thing, right? This is why your program exists. But notice that I'm entirely dependent on there being a way for you all to express the welfare assessments that you might do in a way that can be converted into units, common units, via the method I'm proposing, right? So if you come back and tell me, Bob, nice project, very cute diagrams, all of your comments begin with serious compliments, you can tell. But so if you do that and then say, but look, we just don't see a way of non-arbitrarily giving you these percent estimates, well, then that would just bankrupt the project, right? You can't proceed. That's not quite true. There are some things I could say about that, but I think from 30,000 feet, it's very bad for the project. That being said, I just don't think you really believe that, right? I think you might say, oh, look, it's really, really hard to be confident about various aspects of welfare, and that there's a lot where we are really uncertain. But again, if you think about what the objective is here, when you're trying to make basic decisions, we're often going to be able to say things like, well, what we care about is usually the worst case scenarios. So, no one here thinks that when you use ventilation shutdown to depopulate a chicken facility, that those animals are like at the top end of the welfare range, right? You're all pretty confident that they're in the negative end of the spectrum, and maybe it's about as bad as it can get for a chicken to like suffocate and essentially be cooked alive over some number of hours. So you have some rough ideas, and then the question is just, okay, given that, can we sort of rank some other welfare states relative to those to give us at least an ordinal ordering that we could map onto some kind of scale? Now with arthropods, that's going to be harder. We know less about them, but still you're going to use some of the same kind of metrics you're used to using, right? What are the mortality rates in the system? What are the rates of injury? Do we see normal amounts of feeding, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How much did, what's the disease load in this particular environment? And those are imperfect, right? But they're the kinds of things we're used to using anyway, and we're just going to use them again here. Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.